With our webinar on clinical trials. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is my first time using our online phone system, so if the audio cuts out, please feel free to write it in the question box, and I will try to remedy that as soon as possible. Okay, so just as a little reminder here about what the CLRC does, our mission is to provide information and resources on cancer-related legal issues to cancer patients, survivors, caregivers, healthcare professionals, employers, and others coping with cancer. We're a program of the Disability Rights Legal Center, and although we are a national program, we are currently based in Los Angeles. So I will do my best to try to answer some questions at the end of today's webinar, but I just wanted to remind you that if I'm not able to answer questions today, or if you have other questions that come up, or if you think of friends or family or patients of yours who you think might benefit from having some of their questions answered, we do have a national telephone assistance line that they can call, or that you can call. The number is 866-843-2572, so that's 866-THE-CLRC. And we also have an online intake form at clrcintake.org, which sometimes is a little bit easier to get through just because we do have a pretty high call volume. So, just keep in mind that if I'm not able to answer questions today, it's not the end of the road. You can certainly follow up with us on our telephone assistance line. So you guys are here today to learn a little bit about clinical trials. So what exactly is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a research study that is designed to find out if new treatments, drugs, or procedures are safe and effective. And I did see that there is one question really quickly that I'm going to address at the beginning here. We will be posting a recording of the webinar as well as the slides on our website. So if you want to share them with others, please feel free to do so. They probably will be up within the next week or two. Okay, so going back, a clinical trial is a study that people volunteer for to test out these new treatments, drugs, or procedures. And some people might be kind of afraid of some of the uncertainty of new treatments, but sometimes clinical trials do provide patients with access to really high quality care and treatments before they're actually widely available. Governmental and non-governmental organizations might be the ones who are sponsoring the clinical trials, and people can participate in clinical trials at a wide variety of different locations. So you might be being treated at a hospital that's also running clinical trials, or your doctor's office might also be running clinical trials. There are some doctor's offices where all they do is run clinical trials. So, it's not just limited to hospitals or just limited to doctor's offices. It's really a wide range of whoever wants to be an investigator can certainly apply and try to get sponsorship for a study. So, in order to make scientific advances, doctors create these research studies that involve volunteers called clinical trials. Many of these clinical trials are evaluating treatments to see whether they are safe or effective or possibly better than whatever the current standard treatment is. But there are a lot of different types of clinical trials. Some studies test different combinations of existing treatments, possibly new approaches to radiation therapy or surgery, and obviously new methods of treatment as well. There are some that really focus more on side effects and symptoms during treatment. And then there are also studies that involve prevention of cancer, not just treatments once you've already been diagnosed. And I believe the American Cancer Society was, recruiting quite a bit in the last 2 years for a cancer prevention study. So that's just another example of, of a different type of clinical trial, basically. I think a lot of people sometimes think of clinical trials and they get a little bit nervous because, one thing that we do hear about sometimes is the idea of a placebo. So a placebo is an inactive drug or treatment in a clinical trial, which is sometimes called a sugar pill. And so sometimes people might be afraid, oh, well, if I sign up for a clinical trial, what if I'm not actually getting treatment? What if, I'm just getting a sugar pill? Well, some clinical trials, which are called placebo-controlled clinical trials, compare a new treatment with a placebo, an inactive drug. But the use of placebos alone in cancer clinical trials is pretty rare. They're used sometimes when there's no effective treatment, or they're given in addition to standard treatment, maybe to see whether side effects would be different with the placebo versus a new pill or something like that. So, obviously the research team would let the participant know when a placebo is a possible option in the study. So it's not like you would necessarily be surprised by it. So why are clinical trials important? Cancer clinical trials have led to pretty significant scientific advances that have increased doctors' understanding of how and why tumors develop and grow. So this knowledge has helped doctors make progress in preventing cancer, in diagnosing cancer, slowing or stopping the development of cancer, and also finding cancers that have come back after treatment. Because clinical trials may involve hundreds or even thousands of people, it often takes quite a bit of time to find out the results. So it's an ongoing process. As new information is learned and studied, new standards of care are added to or replace the old standards. Now, there is actually a pretty low participation rate when it comes to adults and clinical trials. Less than 5% of adults with cancer actually enroll in them, compared to more than 60% of children with cancer who receive treatment through a clinical trial. So it's sort of interesting to think about the fact that a lot of adults seem to either maybe not know about clinical trials or are either not qualified or maybe avoid them. It's also really important for people of all ethnic backgrounds and both genders to participate in clinical trials because different types of cancer drugs were traditionally tested on, white men. That's sort of who was available. And there is some evidence, there have been a few studies that suggest that different genders or different ethnic backgrounds might react differently to different types of drugs. So, it is important that doctors are able to understand exactly how these drugs or treatments affect sort of anyone who might be, diagnosed and need treatment. So what are your rights if you decide to participate in a clinical trial? Well, you certainly have the right not to participate. You are not required to participate in a clinical trial if you are not comfortable with that. Your doctor might certainly suggest a clinical trial to you, but if you're not interested in, a lot of people use the term human guinea pig. If that's not for you, certainly you don't have to participate. But if you do decide that you want to know more, you are entitled to have comprehensive information about the study. And that's basically what we mean by informed consent. So informed consent means that you know about the possible risks and benefits associated with participating in this clinical trial. So research institutions are actually required to obtain informed consent from every person who decides to participate in a clinical trial. Informed consent is used to protect the safety and privacy of the person who's enrolled in the clinical trial. So in order to participate in this informed consent process, it is generally ongoing. There might be some forms to fill out at the beginning, but essentially the way it works is that it typically involves one or more conversations between the patient or the participant and the trial investigators. So that might be your doctor, it might be a completely different researcher or investigator, but whoever the person is who's conducting the clinical trial. You might also need to talk to other members of your healthcare team, research nurses or assistants, or your doctor if your doctor is not involved in the trial directly. And it also includes a review of the written consent form with the patient. Usually those written consent forms are pretty detailed, and hopefully they should be written at a pretty low reading level so that most people who, are able to read English can understand it. So hopefully it's not all in, legalese or, really crazy complicated medical jargon. So the research team should also explain how the new treatment is different from the standard treatment. And the research team also has to list out the possible risks and benefits, if there are any, of the new treatment, which may or may not be different from the risks and benefits of the standard treatment. So, sometimes we think, okay, well, this is new, it's a new treatment, it's probably going to have a lot of really scary risks and a lot of side effects. But when we're talking about cancer treatment, the traditional treatments themselves also have a lot of side effects and potential risks involved. So, it's possible that the risk factor might be basically the same, but it really just depends on, what type of trial you're looking at and, maybe what the traditional treatment is for your type or stage of cancer. Now, the other thing that's involved in the informed consent process is that the research team also has to explain to the patient what exactly it is they need to do in order to participate in the trial. So that includes the number of doctor visits, the number of tests, the schedule of treatment, as well as the right to withdraw from the study at any time without a penalty. Other topics covered during the discussion would include potential costs, protection of privacy, and whom to contact with questions or concerns, because you are entitled to ask questions. So, this last part, it seems like maybe not a big deal. Like, of course they'd have to tell me how many times I'd have to go visit the doctor. But usually for clinical trials, the scheduling of appointments is extremely important, because maybe they need to know for data collection purposes, exactly how someone is reacting at month 1, month 2, month 3, so that they can compare it to the data of all of the other patients who are coming in at month 1, month 2, month 3. If you know in advance that you aren't going to be able to, make certain appointments, that could throw off your data and potentially disqualify you from that particular study. There might be other studies that you're eligible for, but we'll talk a little bit more about eligibility for clinical trials. So you do have the right, again, to ask questions and to have informed consent. It is very important that you understand both the risks and the benefits before signing up for a study. So there are some other safeguards in place for patients who are enrolled in clinical trials. There are various committees and agencies that oversee patient safety before, during, and after clinical trials. So first of all, there are IRBs, which is an institutional review board. And an IRB is an independent committee of a whole bunch of different types of people. So that could include doctors, community advocates, clergy, lawyers, and others who ensure that a clinical trial is ethical and that the rights and welfare of study participants are protected. Every single clinical trial in the United States must be approved and monitored by an IRB to make sure the risks are as low as possible and that the risks are outweighed by the potential benefits. So usually, when the investigators are deciding that they want to start a clinical trial, they have to get IRB approval first. They have to submit information about what the trial is going to be about, how they're going to run it, and then the IRB has to review it to determine whether or not they think it's safe and worthwhile. There are also federal agencies that oversee patient safety, and so that can include the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA, and also the National Institutes of Health. The FDA and the NIH are responsible for approving drugs and monitoring research, and both agencies make and enforce regulations to ensure safe participants. Now there is another agency or committee that helps to oversee some patient safety, and that's called the Data Safety Monitoring Board. The DSMB is an independent group of doctors and medical ethicists, statisticians, and other health professionals that monitor clinical trials for safety and scientific relevance throughout the study period. So for example, if a whole bunch of people are, dropping out of a study because of the side effects, the Data Safety Monitoring Board might take a look at that and say, you know what, all of these people are leaving the study because it doesn't seem safe, the study should be shut down. Or alternatively, if people are really, really, really benefiting from a particular new drug or study, they might determine, you know what, it's really not ethical for there to be a control group using the standard treatment versus this other group who's getting this new drug and really benefiting. They should all get access to the new drug. So, they're monitoring while the study is going on. It's separate from an IRB because the IRB usually looks at the clinical trial before it starts. And then the DSMB reviews the study after it starts and makes recommendations to the IRB about stopping or continuing the study. So that's sort of how they differ. So how are clinical trials conducted? Clinical trials are usually conducted in a series of 4 different phases or research testing steps. And phase 1 is the first time testing a new drug or procedure on humans. So researchers test safe dosages and different ways of giving the drug or procedure to the patient. So for example, either giving a drug orally or by injecting it with a needle. And the researchers really carefully observe any side effects. So during a phase 1 study, sometimes you'll have to actually stay in the hospital or stay, somewhere nearby on site where you can really be monitored very closely because it is the first time testing on humans. They might not be aware before they, administer the drug what types of side effects or the severity of side effects that might occur. The purpose of a phase 1 clinical trial is to learn how safe the drug or therapy is in people, to find the best dose and schedule, and study how it might help treat cancer. Doctors should and patients should, consider participation in phase 1 clinical trials not only as, sort of a last-ditch effort to treat cancer, but there can be benefits from enrolling in a phase 1 clinical trial even earlier on in your cancer treatment. Now, when we're talking about phase 1 trials, these are generally quite small. It'll be a pretty small group of people as opposed to, hundreds and hundreds of different people having this tested on them. for the first time. So phase 2 occurs when, phase 1 has already, maybe a drug has already gone through phase 1, it's been, proven to be, effective or safe to use on humans. Phase 2 studies study both the safety and effectiveness of a treatment and evaluate how the drug or the procedure affects your body. So these studies are usually specific to one type of cancer, and they often have fewer than 100 patients. So, they're further, a phase 2 trial is generally further evaluating safety beyond, what they evaluated in the phase 1. And it is usually a larger group than phase 1, but it's still not a huge, section of the population. So phase 3 is the next step for a drug to go through in order to get approval. And these trials usually will compare the new treatment with the standard treatment, the current standard treatment. And then participants might be randomly assigned to the new treatment group or to the standard treatment group so that they can effectively compare and contrast. And again, they're still looking at the effectiveness and also at side effects. And phase 3 trials usually are much larger than phase 2 or phase 1. And then we get to phase 4. So phase 4 clinical trials really are evaluating the long-term safety and effectiveness of a certain drug or treatment. So these trials research, how it affects someone in the long term, and they usually take place after treatment has been approved for widespread use. So, after phase 3, maybe it's been determined that a drug is effective, they've determined what the right type of dosage is, the FDA might approve it, but then there might still be a phase 4 clinical trial going on, despite the fact it's already been approved for widespread use. But phase 4 will determine, how are these people faring, 5, 10 years down the road, or, a year down the road, and, are there any long-term effects that we need to be concerned about? So again, why might you want to participate in a clinical trial? Well, there are obviously many possible benefits associated with participating in a trial. You can potentially have access to high-quality care. There is generally very close monitoring by doctors, and you're potentially playing a role in improving future treatments for others. And then, on a more selfish level, of course, you might be the first to benefit from a new treatment or procedure before it actually is able to go on the market for widespread use. However, there are, of course, always risks to consider, just like with any other type of medical treatment. Of course, if it's a new drug or a new procedure or a new treatment, it might not work. It might not work as well as the traditional treatment would have. There also might be side effects that you didn't anticipate. At least with some of the standard treatments, the side effects are generally pretty well documented because they've already gone through all of these clinical trials and different phases of trials. With a new drug or treatment, maybe those side effects aren't known yet. As I mentioned, the new treatments might not be better than the old one. And you might also need additional tests, which may be uncomfortable or time-consuming. So the time factor certainly could factor in there as, not so much a risk as just an inconvenience, because some studies, and it really just does vary from study to study, sometimes you go in once or twice, it's pretty simple, no big deal. Other studies really require a lot of monitoring and a lot of testing, so you might have to go in for blood work once a week or once a month, and in addition to all of your other doctor's appointments. So that's certainly something to keep in mind when you're contemplating whether or not you're interested in signing up for a clinical trial. So one of the things that, certainly can be a huge concern is the costs associated with clinical trials. So now that you understand a little bit about what clinical trials are and, maybe why you should or shouldn't want to participate, you might be wondering what you'd have to pay if you decided to participate in one. So previously, many states had their own state laws regarding insurance coverage for clinical trials. Some of them were limited just to cancer clinical trials, and others applied to all types of approved clinical trials. However, when the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, it outlined many changes with respect to health insurance coverage generally, and health insurance coverage with respect to clinical trials. So as part of the ACA, that's what I'm going to refer to the Affordable Care Act as, the ACA. As part of the ACA, plans or insurers cannot deny patients participation in a clinical trial, limit or deny coverage of routine costs to patients who choose to participate in an approved clinical trial, or increase costs because a patient chooses to participate in a clinical trial. This means that your insurer cannot limit your benefits if you choose to enroll in a clinical trial. So essentially, health insurance must cover the routine costs of approved trials. And they cannot discriminate against you for participating in a clinical trial. So what is a routine cost? Well, if you are, going through treatment and your doctor requires that you have, let's say you have breast cancer and your doctor requires a mammography every 6 months to determine, how things are going. So if you were going to be if your insurance company or your insurance policy was already going to be covering 2 mammograms per year per, what your doctor said and per your insurance coverage, if you decided to participate in a clinical trial that, for your breast cancer treatment, and if the clinical trial required, let's say, 4 mammograms per year, your insurance company wouldn't necessarily be required to cover the other 2, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But if your insurance company was already going to be covering 2 of those mammograms, that would be considered a routine cost, and you would likely be able to get that covered by your insurance policy. So what's an approved trial? It says that you cannot, that insurance must cover routine costs of approved trials. So an approved clinical trial is a study being done for the prevention, detection, or treatment of cancer or another life-threatening illness. And according to the law, it has to meet basically 2 major criteria. So it either has to be federally funded and have an investigational new drug application, or it has to be federally funded and exempt from IND requirements. So federally funded means that the clinical trial is approved or funded by one or more of the following organizations. So the National Institutes of Health, which I had already mentioned earlier, NIH, and there are organizations under the NIH, such as the National Cancer Institute, NCI, which also counts. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs, or the Department of Energy, if the trial is subject to an unbiased scientific review by experts that are similar to NIH requirements. So basically, if it's sponsored by the NIH, the National Cancer Institute, CDC, any of these federal agencies, it's probably going to meet that first criteria of being federally funded. Now, it also either has to have an IND application, or it has to be exempt from IND application requirements. So what that means is that researchers generally have to submit an application for an investigational new drug to the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, to give a drug in clinical trials. If you're not sure whether it has that application, you can ask your doctor or the sponsor of the trial, and they'd be able to tell you whether it has that IND application. Alternatively, it could be exempt from an IND application requirement. If it's not a new drug, but instead they're actually just testing a drug that's already approved to either change the drug's labeling, advertising a new use for the drug, or testing a new dosage or way to give the drug, they might be exempt from having to submit an application for a new drug. So if it meets one of these, if it meets two of these requirements here, it's federally funded, and it either has an IND application or it's exempt from IND requirements, then it's considered an approved trial, and your insurance will likely have to cover the routine costs associated. Now, one of the other interesting things here about this part of the Affordable Care Act is that there's no preemption for more protective state laws. So what that means is, generally when we talk about a federal law versus a state law, the federal law is the law of the land, right? Like the Constitution, the federal Constitution is what rules us. A state constitution might be, subordinate to federal law. For example, if a state tried to pass a law that said, that anyone could enter the country, just come to California and you can become president. If California decided to pass that law, the federal Constitution says, no, you have to have been born in the United States in order to be president, et cetera, et cetera. For clinical trials here, under the ACA, there is no preemption for more protective state laws. That means that if you live in a state that has a state law that provides lots of protection for people who are applying for participation in a clinical trial, your state's law is the law of the land. So there are, quite a few states that require health insurance plans to cover routine costs of a clinical trial. Some of those are limited just to cancer clinical trials, as I mentioned. Many of them apply to all types of clinical trials. Each state's law is different, so if you have questions about what your state's law is regarding clinical trials, you can certainly contact the CLRC. Now, the major thing that I do want to point out here is that this part of the Affordable Care Act about clinical trials does not apply to grandfathered plans. So, what's a grandfathered plan? A grandfathered plan is a health insurance policy that was issued prior to March 23rd, 2010, which is when the Affordable Care Act was passed. So unless there have been substantial changes to your health insurance policy, if you had a health insurance policy that existed before May 23rd, 2010, it's possible that your insurance might not have to cover these routine costs associated with clinical trials. However, if you live in a state that already had clinical trial laws in place, you might have already had that benefit regardless of whether the Affordable Care Act was passed. So even though this makes it seem like, oh no, my plan probably isn't covered, it's more than it's certainly more than half of states that currently have additional clinical trial protection. So if you're really concerned about whether or not your health insurance policy is going to cover routine costs associated with clinical trials, you should first look to see, okay, is it a grandfathered plan? And if you're not sure whether it's a grandfathered plan, your plan actually does have to notify you of its grandfathered status in all its informational materials that describe your plan benefits. And if you're still not sure based on what the information is they've sent you, you can contract the Department of Labor or your state's insurance, like Department of Insurance, to determine whether or not your plan is grandfathered. So once you've determined that, if it turns out, yes, it is grandfathered, then you probably want to double check what your state's laws are regarding clinical trial coverage, because it's likely that you would still have this benefit regardless of whether or not your plan is grandfathered. So what is not covered? Let's say that you do have a plan that is covered by the ACA here with respect to clinical trials. They're required to cover routine costs associated with approved trials. So what's not covered? Well, usually the investigational treatment itself is not covered. You generally wouldn't have to pay yourself, or your insurance company would not have to pay for a new drug that hasn't been on the market yet. Usually the sponsor of the trial is the one that's responsible for those costs. What also would not be covered are specifying data collection and analysis needs. So the example I used before with respect to, let's say your insurance would have already covered 2 mammograms per year and you enroll in a trial that requires 4. The other 2, which would be solely for satisfying data collection and analysis needs, those 2 would likely not be covered by your insurance and would likely be covered by the sponsor of the trial. And if not, there's a potential that you would have to pay for those services. And then, of course, your insurance policy would not have to cover any service that's clearly inconsistent with the standards of care. So clinical trials under Medicare, the ACA does not actually affect Medicare coverage of clinical trials. Medicare already covers the routine costs related to clinical trials and will continue to cover those costs. Medicare covers any drugs, procedures, or services you need while participating in the trial that would normally be covered through Medicare, even if you would not be participating in the trial. So again, routine costs associated with approved trials. They can't discriminate against you for participating, and you do have the same type of coverage under Medicare Advantage, Original Medicare, or any other Medicare plan. So, again, what's not covered, it's basically the same as what we just mentioned with respect to private insurance. So the item or service itself, if it's a new drug, Medicare is not going to cover the cost of that drug unless it would have been covered outside of the study. Again, they would not cover items or services solely for satisfying data collection and analysis needs, just like we talked about with respect to private insurance. And then, co-pays and deductibles would still potentially be your responsibility. So what about under Medicaid? So, Medicare, which we just discussed, is the federal program for people who are 65 years of age or older, or who have been on SSDI, receiving disability benefits for at least 2 years, or, there's a couple other ways to be eligible for Medicare. But generally speaking, most of the people who are on Medicare are 65 or older. Medicaid, on the other hand, and it's called different things in different states. In California, we call it Medi-Cal. In Tennessee, it's called TennCare. So those are all state Medicaid programs. And Medicaid is, the program that provides health care coverage for people who are low income and also potentially have, other situations going on where they're either disabled or potentially, pregnant or have dependent children or elderly or blind. So that's what, each state has its own Medicaid program. And there is no federal law that actually requires coverage for clinical trials under Medicaid. However, some states do provide coverage, so if you have questions about whether or not your state provides coverage for Medicaid, you can certainly contact us here at the CLRC. So what do you do if your insurance denies coverage for the clinical trial? Certainly you should contact your healthcare provider team to see if they can assist you. And it says to contact your insurance company to find out why they denied coverage. Because of certain parts of the Affordable Care Act, they're actually generally required now to tell you why they've denied coverage for a certain treatment. So, once you get that information and you've spoken to your doctor, you're probably going to want to go through your insurance internal appeals process. So an internal appeals process is where you go, directly back to the insurance company and you say, no, you were wrong about, making this decision about paying for this treatment. Here's why. And then, they'll give you an answer. Sometimes there are 2 or 3 levels of internal appeals that you have to go through before you can go to an outside agency for an external appeal or an independent medical review. So some states call it an independent medical review, others call it an external appeal. But you might be eligible if you go through the internal appeals process with your insurance company and they still deny you, you might be eligible to contact an independent third party for an external appeal, so that someone outside, unaffiliated with your insurance company, can review whether or not you should have been reimbursed, or whether your routine costs should have been covered by your insurance company. So one of the questions that we get the most often at the CLRC about clinical trials is, why did I get turned down? I think a lot of people think that clinical trials should be open to anyone who wants to participate. And obviously it is, pretty important to have as many people enrolled as possible. But there are some pretty strict rules about who can participate in a given clinical trial, and a lot of those are for safety reasons. So each clinical trial follows a set of rules called a protocol that describes who can participate in the study and how treatment will be given and monitored. So all clinical trials have requirements about who can join, called inclusion and exclusion criteria. Examples of the criteria can be a person's age, the type of disease, medical history, and current health. So inclusion criteria help make sure that all people in the clinical trial are medically similar. For example, the inclusion criteria may require that each participant have the same type of cancer or same stage of disease. So for example, stage 2A colorectal cancer. If the people have too many medical differences, the doctors will have more difficulty interpreting the results. Likewise, exclusion criteria help keep people safe. So for example, it's not often safe for people with a severe heart condition or kidney failure to receive some types of cancer treatments. So they might be excluded from some clinical trials. Sometimes, if someone has already gone through chemotherapy, that might be something that is excluding them from a certain type of trial, or if they've gone through, radiation treatment or something. So they might, look at not only the stage of your disease or the type of cancer that you have, but they might look to see what types of treatments you've already had, because that can certainly play a role in, whether or not they're able to determine whether this new treatment is actually effective. Because what if it turns out, oh, you went through chemo and you went through the traditional treatment and that's what ended up helping you out, not the new treatment, that could certainly make their data a little bit more fuzzy. So where do you find out information about clinical trials? So first and foremost, talk to your doctor. Your doctor might be aware of certain trials that you might fit the criteria for automatically. They might be able to suggest people or places that you should go talk to, but there are also, quite a few places where you can look online to see whether or not there are trials that you might potentially be eligible for. So clinicaltrials.gov is a good place to start, as well as the National Cancer Institute Clinical Trials website. And as I mentioned before, I will be posting these slides on our website, so you don't have to worry too much about writing each of these down, but feel free. There's also breastcancertrials.org. The American Cancer Society has a clinical trial matching service. And so if you go to that link, they have a toll-free number, I believe, that you can call. There's also a few other ones I didn't include on this slide, but there's the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. They have a search engine at searchclinicaltrials.org. There's also CenterWatch. There's the Coalition of Cancer Cooperative Groups, Emerging Med Navigator, and then there's also the World Health Organization International Clinical Trials Registry Platform Search Portal. That is a mouthful. The World Health Organization Health Matters within the United Nations, and so they have a database that allows people to search clinical trial registration information from many countries' registries. So, if you've looked for clinical trials here in the U.S. and you haven't found anything, it's possible that there might be something outside the U.S. that you might be interested in participating in. So the World Health Organization International Clinical Trials Registry Platform Search Portal is where you would go to look for that. So what are some questions you might want to ask your doctor? Well, you might want to ask which trials are open to you. And then if the doctor does know about certain trials that you might be eligible for, you might want to ask, up front, what are the risks and benefits? What are my other options? What's the purpose of the trial? Is the purpose of the trial to try out an old drug for a new use, or is it trying out a brand new drug? And then, of course, how much is it going to cost you? Your doctor might not know that information right up front, but hopefully people on your healthcare team might be able to at least point you in the direction to know whether or not it's an approved trial, and then you can do your research to figure out, okay, what's going to be covered and what's not. So deciding to participate in a clinical trial is a pretty complex decision, and for some patients, a clinical trial may be the best treatment option available. Because standard treatments are not perfect, patients are often willing to face the added uncertainty of a clinical trial in hope for a better result. So, there are certainly other options available beyond just the standard treatment if you're not comfortable with the standard treatment or if it hasn't worked for you in the past. So please, certainly always feel free to ask your doctor, do some research on your own, look to see if there are other options for you, because not only would you potentially benefit from, participation in a clinical trial, but it also would help, research and help advance cancer treatment in general for others. So I'm going to stop the recording here, and I have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.